But for various reasons, we got pushed a little bit into October. But thankfully, this is a topic of perennial interest. So there's never any shortage of things to say about this. We've heard a lot in the news lately about speech and security and the press, of course. Not really just the past few months, but the past many years. I'm thinking in terms of prosecutions of the press, lots of leaks across several administrations, all those issues and kind of the associated cultural dynamics associated with them. So that's kind of what today is about. There's some perspectives that we're going to hear from tonight that will help us kind of think about those. It isn't necessarily the typical panel on these that you might hear about on for civil liberties or other think tanks. We've brought together a couple of voices tonight to think about kind of the relation of free speech to a free society and how those, as I said, cultural and other dynamics shape how we think about the intersection of press and free speech with national security. I want to acknowledge our partners for this evening's event. First of all, the Jack Miller Center, which sponsors a lot of Constitution Day events around the country, and also our friends at Carnegie Mellon University. Got a number of students here from my class. They have to be here, but thank you all for coming out without being required. Sort of a bit of logistics, just in case we have to exit the building for some sort of emergency or something.
Emergency.
Yeah, national security emergency. We've got exits in the back, as well as, of course, the stairway you came up. But just look to me, and I'll take care of you. So why don't we go ahead and get started? We're going to start from my side and work down. First up is Gabriel Schoenfeld. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he wrote a book about 8 years ago, I think it was, entitled Necessary Secrets, National Security, the Media, and the Rule of Law. That was in 2010. I've taught that book and enjoyed it, and I've been looking to have him out ever since. And Gabe's going to kind of kick us off here with some thoughts on, let's say, leaking and how it relates to the current policy environment. I think I'll go ahead and let you have you speak, and then I'll introduce this other speaker.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at CSAS. I actually was a fellow here from 1990 to 1994, and I was working on Russian affairs, and I started a publication called Soviet Prospects. And such was my profound knowledge of the field that 4 months later I had to rename it Post-Soviet Prospects. I want to say a bit about how I came to the subject of secrecy, which was not as a policy analyst, but as a New Yorker who had lived in New York through 9/11, had kids who were riding the subway. I was riding the subway. Along came the attack in Madrid on the transit system, killing 53 people. The following year, in 2005, we had the attack of in London, killing over 190 people. People in New York riding the subway thought about such things. And at the end of 2006, the New York Times, James Risen and Eric Lichtblau, two reporters, published a story revealing the existence of a highly secret counterterrorism program, terrorist surveillance program, that was designed to intercept the communications of al-Qaeda terrorists. And I, at that time, was reviewing Risen's forthcoming book, which also covered the same material. And as I was reading it and reviewing it, the question that came to me was, is it legal to publish such highly classified secrets? Secrets that the revelation of which place us as New Yorkers and all Americans in danger. And I wrote a short piece arguing that it was illegal and that Bill Keller of the New York Times should be prosecuted. My position has evolved quite a bit since then, particularly in writing the book. But I certainly, from that case, it's very clear that the leakers involved, if they had been apprehended, would be subject to criminal liability. And in fact, one of Risen's sources, Jeffrey Sterling, was in fact prosecuted and sent to prison for 5 years. He's now in a halfway home here in DC, I believe. There's also the question of whether the government could compel James Risen to reveal his sources, as they did with Judith Miller in the Valerie Plame imbroglio. And I think the law there is fairly clear that it didn't come to that in that case. But it is possible to subpoena and compel a journalist to reveal his sources. There's no national, federal level shield law that would protect journalists in that case. And finally, the question is whether journalists themselves can be prosecuted. There are statutes on the books which make it a crime to publish certain kinds of classified material. Not all sorts of classified material, but very narrow sectors, including atomic secrets and communications intelligence. Now, the Times story, the TSP, the Terrorist Surveillance Program, was a communications intelligence program. So I think they were vulnerable, but in the event, the Bush administration did not proceed with a prosecution. And I think in retrospect, that's a great thing. And we've never had a prosecution of the press in this country, and I think we should be proud of that. It became closest during World War II when the Chicago Tribune revealed after the Battle of Midway that the United States had broken Japanese codes. But the prosecution there didn't go forward because they didn't want to draw attention to the leak. Now, if I was quite hawkish about leaks and prosecutions of leakers back in 2006, my position has really evolved because I could not have imagined that we would be living under the Trump administration, and where I think the ethics of leaking are reversed. I mean, it's always problematic for an individual bureaucrat to take it upon himself to decide what is public and what's not, in violation of the rules. But when you have an executive that's in effect waging war on the Constitution or grossly violating its norms, I think we depend upon those leaks to learn about what is going on in the administration. And we've seen some really spectacular leaks, and some of them have involved sources and methods and may have compromised sources and methods. So for example, the leak that revealed that General Flynn had been negotiating over sanctions with Ambassador Kislyak was based upon an intercept, and our interception capabilities may have been compromised. But nevertheless, the public learned a great deal. But I think in the end, Trump is violating norms left and right and approaching illegality in some of his conduct. We have to resist mirroring him, lest all the institutions collapse and we lapse into lawlessness. But I think that leaks are, as a kind of form of civil disobedience, are very valuable in this moment.
Okay, great. Well, I'm definitely going to come back to you with how your position has evolved. But right now I'm going to turn to Melanie Marlowe, a fellow at Carnegie Mellon University, Institute for Politics and Strategy. She's the co-author of The Obama Presidency and the Constitutional Order, and has another book project on the Trump presidency and the Constitutional Order. We've had some projects together, including a book on national security law that's coming out next year. She's going to be talking a bit on the history of these issues to put kind of the current situation that we just heard about in a little bit more context. So over to you, Melanie.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the right and ability of citizens to speak against their government in times of war, and I might touch just a little bit on the press. We have very mixed feelings about speech and war. War is the most serious objective that a nation can undertake. People are going to die, maybe a lot of people. A lot of treasure will be expended. Important other national priorities are going to be put on hold or maybe rejected entirely. And because it is so encompassing, governments want and generally need the citizenry behind them. But what if the war is not going well or not going as well as it should be? Or what if it's wrong in its goals or perhaps its methods? And so as a very serious undertaking, shouldn't we be sure it's the right thing to do in terms of effectiveness and in morality? So public and government debate, no matter how high-minded or sometimes how low, might be legitimate and valuable for good decision making. But others are going to see it as aiding the enemy, letting our adversaries know we are weak in morale or in ability, and cause more time to be spent in conflict and more American lives to be lost. So these questions about speech and national security, what's appropriate and legitimate for the government to prohibit or allow, have a history as long as the country itself. So against the backdrop of turmoil between France and England across the ocean, the quasi-war that we were having with France, welcome, and discontent between Republicans and Federalists at home, in 1798, President Adams signed the Alien Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act made it a crime to publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing, so who would be caught up in that, against the President, Congress, or government of the United States with the intent to bring them into contempt or disrepute. This was used exclusively by the in-power Federalists to prosecute their enemies, the out-of-power Republicans. They used it to suppress publishers, members of Congress, and even ordinary citizens from making comments about the president. There was one poor drunk at a parade who heard some gunshots going off, and he said he hoped one of the bullets would hit President Adams in the ass. And for that, the poor guy had a $100 fine. There were 25 people arrested, 10 convictions by Federalist courts. And by the time President Jefferson took office in 1801, he pardoned the offenders. And the Congress of 1840 looked back on that and said it was a mistaken exercise of power, and they repaid the fines that had been due to those convictions. So we move up a few years, a few decades to the Civil War. This war's not far away. It's hundreds of thousands of Americans dying on the doorstep here. States have seceded, families and friends are fighting. The idea that Maryland might secede from the Union would put Washington, D.C., the capital of the Union, in the Confederacy. Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus about 8 times, and a writ issued in September of 1862 declared that persons discouraging enlistments, resisting drafts, or guilty of any disloyal practice shall be subject to martial law and triable by military commissions. So this is more than just detention. It's moving ahead with trial and punishment. And between 13,000 and 38,000 people were swept up as a result. In March of 1863, General Burnside issued General Order Number 38, which stated that declaring sympathies with the enemy will no longer be tolerated. This leads us to the case of Clement Vallandigham, quite a colorful character. He's not a nobody. He was the Speaker of the House of the Ohio Representatives. He was a congressman from Ohio. He and Edwin Stanton had been best friends. Stanton had lent him $500 for him to begin his law practice, or his law studies. And he was a delegate to the 1860 Democratic Convention. He spoke out against the war frequently. And in Mount Vernon, Ohio, he spoke out against the war for 2 hours. There's a lot of bad things you can say about the president and about a war effort in 2 hours. He, at the end, concluded by saying he wanted people to exercise their right to vote in order to hurl King Lincoln from his throne. A few days later, he was arrested at his home in Dayton at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he was tried, even though he was a civilian, by a military commission. His punishment, oddly enough, was to be put into exile. If you like the Confederate cause so much, go join the Confederacy. So they sent him to the South. He didn't like it very much there. He broke the Union blockade and escaped to Bermuda, and from Bermuda he went to Nova Scotia. From Nova Scotia he settled in Ontario. From Ontario he won the Democratic nomination for the Ohio governorship, which he lost. But he came back by 1864. He took up his practice of talking against the government in Ohio. Now the press, even the press in the North, was very upset about what had happened, and they excoriated the government for doing this to this man. Now, there were lots of prosecutions, and we know, different things happened in different places, and this was one of the problems with the war, is that orders were happening in different places, and it depended on the military situation, it depended on what the general did. So there wasn't legislation passed prohibiting speech, there were very ad hoc policies and enforcement. So we'll skip up to World War I. I'm just going to say a couple of things because I'm going to be put in speech panel prison if I don't hurry. But World War I is a different war. It's not happening on our doorstep. It's far away. And by the time we are getting into it, there are hundreds of thousands of people who have died. And people don't want to go. They think that it's, people here are debating this, back when we really debated wars. And they're concerned that this is a war to benefit arms manufacturers at the expense of poor and working class people who are going to go die. So eventually Wilson asks for a declaration, he gets it. A month later, you need bodies. He asks for a draft law, and he gets it. And these are very unpopular laws, the war and the draft law. So the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918, they make it a crime to criticize the administration, war effort, or draft, punishable by up to 20 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. About 2,000 people are prosecuted under these laws, and it affected from nobodies to prominent individuals such as Eugene Debs. And many courts bent over backwards to read the malicious intent that was required by the law into these actions in order to secure prosecutions. Now, interestingly, now these cases are going to the Supreme Court, so courts are getting involved where it had just been presidents or generals or Congresses earlier. But the Supreme Court is siding with the government and not with individuals in these cases. So, moving up to 9/11 and today, it's really interesting to go back and look what was said, often in online commentary, but also law review articles shortly after 9/11. A lot of speculation that there was going to be legislation that would restrict speech and other liberties. And there were policies of debatable constitutionality. People got watched for things they said. I'm not going to say everything was fine. There was inappropriate and in some cases unconstitutional profiling and discrimination. There was this, you're either with us or against us kind of talk. And maybe we'll talk more about those other things here too. But as far as prosecuting people for verbal or written criticism of the law, for how the war was being waged, or for calling politicians names, for crying out loud, you had plays in New York about, bloodthirsty Dick Cheney and George Bush. We just did not see the kinds of government prosecutions that we did before. Barbara Lee, a congresswoman from California. She was the only member of Congress to vote against the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. She spoke out many times about that conflict, and she speaks out often about all sorts of military conflict. But she, I'm sure, never thought she was in any danger of being swept up. Code Pink. Everyone here probably has been in a meeting where you've seen Code Pink. If you're watching the Kavanaugh hearings, you saw Code Pink. I was at a Senate hearing a couple of months ago. Code Pink members are standing in line talking to the Capitol Police because they know them. Everybody knows what Code Pink is going to do. They're going to go sit down in the hearing. They're going to wait until an opportune moment. They're going to stand up and start saying stuff. The police are going to come over and politely say, if you can't behave, could you please leave, right? There are a few instances where there have been some arrests, but it's because they're violating some security measures or some standard regulations that apply to everybody. We just don't have that kind of suppression. Now, maybe we can get into a little bit later other things that are going on, and there are bad things, and there are things that might cause a chilling effect and so on. But in the end, we do have a tumultuous history with free speech and national security. We have ideals and we don't always live up to them, whether it's out of sheer political interest, whether it's out of fear, or even legitimate concern for the fate of the republic. Second, we don't always make the best decisions in the moment. And it's really hard because every war is different. I always tell my students, war makes bad law because the circumstances are just entirely different. The government can do things and surveil you in ways that we couldn't have comprehended 15 or 50 or 150 years ago. But you all have more access to speak your mind than you did 15 or 50 or 150 years ago. So it's really easy in moments of tension for all of us, the president, Congresses, courts, the press, the public, to overreact. But finally, I would say on the speech front in general, when it comes to national security, while we have a history of making poor and wrong decisions, we also have a history of looking back and seeing where we went wrong and trying to get it better the next time. We looked back after the Alien and Sedition Acts. No laws were passed in 2001. Now, I have no doubt that in the future we're going to have problems again, and we will have to learn from those problems. But our public society, our legal system, our government, we're all more careful and aware about the constitutional and even appropriateness of our actions.
Good. So I'm going to actually skip out of order here a little bit and go over to Jamil. Jamil
Delayed arrival, I apologize.
Yeah, delayed arrival, traffic. Jamil is the founder of the National Security Institute at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where he also teaches. Jamil spent time in the Bush Department of Justice, if I'm not mistaken. He's a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he previously clerked to Justice Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. So over to you to give us some thoughts as well on the current kind of legal scope of things.
So I mean, look, our nation has always had a fraught history. Free speech is at the core of our constitutional values. It is at the core of what our framers fought for against the king, and at the core of what we think of as the core political and civil liberties of Americans. At the same time, our framers well understood the need to protect secrets and the need for expedition in negotiations, the need to preserve national conversations that took place both with foreign leaders as well as information about troop movements and the like. It was at the core of how they fought the War of Independence. It was at the core of how they fought wars after that against our enemies, and it was at the core of how they expanded this nation and made it the country it is today. And so this question of how to protect secrets on one hand, which is inherently undemocratic and inherently counter to the notion of free speech, while at the same time protecting the value of an informed electorate, right? Because the system the framers envisioned doesn't work without a well-informed electorate. And to have a well-informed electorate, keeping secrets away from them undermines that very notion, particularly secrets that the government is keeping in order to protect the national security. And so this tension has been in our system from the very beginning. And we've seen this tension really raise its head up in the modern era, beginning largely with the Pentagon Papers case, right? Where we saw the New York Times on one side, the Washington Post also, as we saw in that well-watched movie recently, fighting over the question whether these national secrets about the Vietnam War, some of which were designed to not simply protect troop movements, but designed to protect the decisions made, erroneous potential decisions made by the administration then in power and the prior administrations before it, and the doubling down on the war in Vietnam, and the secret wars we were fighting in Cambodia and Laos, sort of, not so secret, but secret wars that we were fighting in those countries. And the question whether newspapers could go out and talk about these things, and talk about them publicly. Cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court obviously in a famous decision defending and protecting the right of the papers to publish this information. And these tensions since the Pentagon Papers have not gone away. Right? We've seen them in the modern era with the question whether the New York Times can and should have published information about what we can now talk about as a stellar wind program, the terrorist surveillance program that President Bush famously declassified after that New York Times story. Or about the Snowden disclosures, where Edward Snowden, I think nobody would disagree, violated the law and the requirements he had under the law to protect classified information, but did so at least with respect to one program where he purported to be defending Americans' privacy and civil liberties, a program designed to collect substantially all of the phone calls, or at least information about all the phone calls in the continental United States. Your phone calls, my phone calls, your emails, my emails, the to from information about all those conversations. He also stole and revealed a tremendous amount of other information that had little to no impact on Americans' privacy and civil liberties. The debate about whether Snowden was right or wrong to do that and whether he was a traitor or not. I happen to lean on the side of traitor, but that's a reasonable debate to have. But nobody can argue that, in fact, Edward Snowden did trigger a debate that was valuable in the surveillance arena, which is to say this question whether we should be collecting all this metadata, and if so, under what circumstances. And that debate ultimately led to legislation, the USA Freedom Act, that was passed by Congress and signed by the president, even though both the Bush and Obama administrations had continued this policy all the way till the day that law passed, right, continuously, almost from 9/11 forward, that ultimately did change the way that program functioned. Interestingly, that program didn't go away. It changed form, right? Who held the data changed. The government didn't hold it anymore. The private sector held it. But the data was still accessible under more limited circumstances or more narrow circumstances. But fundamentally, that program stayed in place. The program that had brought Edward Snowden to do the things, or so he says, to do the things he did. And so this tension about whether Snowden was right or wrong, whether the paper should have published that information or not, right? Famously in England, right, the British police went in and seized hard drives and seized computers, right? It didn't happen here, but that tension is still there. There's debate in the Obama administration about whether or not the information about the alleged program to take down the Iranian nuclear activities, the so-called Olympic Games program, Stuxnet, as it's popularly known, right, should have been revealed by the newspapers, right? And the question whether that actually harmed or helped national security, whether the administration was or was not involved in the disclosures, right, is a debated matter. We prosecuted a senior military official in matters related to that leak. In the Bush administration, a senior administration official was prosecuted in part because of a leak about the identity of a CIA officer. Ultimately, it turned out that somebody else had revealed the information, but he apparently, along the way, allegedly lied, and so this was an issue that was brought to the courts. And so this tension about protecting national secrets, which our framers understood was a core part of how you defend and think about and protect a nation, while on the other hand, still defending and protecting the right to free speech and the right of papers to publish that information and to talk about that information and to debate that information, is one that remains really at the core of our national debate. And in an era where there's a huge debate about what is true and what is not true, and in an era where the president regularly goes after the free press, condemning them as parroting fake news, while at the same time being criticized himself by that very fake news press, allegedly, for not telling the whole truth, right? And the press believing it is its core responsibility to call the president out and elected officials out when they don't do those things, right? That debate remains very much alive. In fact, in some ways, this debate between free speech on one hand and the protection of national secrets on the other is really at the core of what we're hearing now is called the post-truth era. And how you ferret that out, and whether, in fact, the Fourth Estate survives this debate, and whether, in fact, free speech survives this debate, is very much at play here. Because in part, some of the speech that we see out there, we now know, is influenced by foreign actors, right? One of the core mediums of free speech that we talk about today, Twitter, right, turns out to be a place full of Russian bots. Facebook turns out to be a place full of Russian bots. Russian bots who, by the way, may or may not have a dog in the fight about who wins, but care very much about creating dissension in our country. So our very core values are now being utilized by foreign actors against us. And they're being utilized in a way that actually harm the very rule of law institutions that were designed to protect these freedoms. The Justice Department, the FBI. And what you see is not just foreign actors trying to play influence here, but now you have fights between the president on one hand, Congress on the other. Republicans in Congress, Democrats in Congress. You have the chair and ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee at each other's throats constantly debating whether a foreign actor tried to influence our elections. I mean, this is a scenario in which our own tools of democracy, the very values our framers espoused and wrote down and enshrined in the Bill of Rights, are being utilized to undermine our ability to effectively govern our own nation. And there are no innocent parties. The president is guilty. Members of Congress are guilty. And we somehow, knowing full well that foreign actors have played this role, can't seem to figure out how to get out of our own way and address the core problem, which is not a question about free speech and not a question about national security, but the fact that we have not actually confronted the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, who are going after us in cyberspace and trying to create this dissension in our culture and are using our own democratic ideals and values against us.
All right, good. Well, thank you. So now, final speaker, Greg Lukianoff, who's the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, or FIRE. So, Greg, given everything that was just said here, you spent a lot of time. Oh man, shameless.
I'm legally obliged to talk about.
You spend a lot of time, on college campuses. Yeah. What can you tell us about kind of the cultural discussion of speech on the campuses, and how that's going to kind of shape the future conversation, the future national security conversation of these things?
Sure. Well, I specialize in First Amendment. That's what I went to law school to study, and since 2001, I've been defending free speech on college campuses. Wrote a book about it with Jonathan Haidt that recently came out. And there were a couple of points that I wanted to make on the way to get there. First was I wanted to recommend the book Liberty's First Crisis, which is a recent book about the Alien Sedition Act, which it's delightful, if you can call something that has so many sad stories in it. What a lot of you probably won't know is that the First Amendment actually was essentially toothless, even though it was passed in 1791, until 1925. That usually comes as a shock to most people. So like a lot of what we think about as America's free speech tradition, it was a cultural tradition. And there's a great book called The People and Their Darling Privilege by Michael Kent Curtis, which I recommend to everybody, that talks about how free speech was mostly maintained as a cultural norm, but legally it had almost no teeth. But then after 1925, with a dip down in the second Red Scare, it started to become really robust. And before I head to campuses, I do always want to plug this one. I think it was George Marshall, but there was a report issued after World War II about why America won the war. And it was first internal, but then it was publicized. And one of the most interesting findings in that postmortem report was the argument that how were we able to defeat these totalitarian governments? These were governments that could wield the entire power of Germany at their whim. Like we're this inefficient, weird system, that can barely get its act together. Like, how did we beat them? And one of the explanations that was given was that a free press and a free society is actually able to identify problems more quickly. So all of those sort of I tell this to university presidents. The student press is going to tell you things that you don't like about your university, but that you desperately need to know. you stifle it at your own peril. And those uncomfortable things that you find out about them are probably the most important ones. Now, what are campuses' role? Campuses' role when it comes to the history of First Amendment, when it comes to its relationship to freedom of speech, are absolutely essential. Pretty much no sooner did you have a strong interpretation of the First Amendment while recovering from the Second Red Scare in the 1950s, you start having cases like Sweezy v. New Hampshire, in which an avowed communist professor was, trying to fire him essentially. But the universities pretty much stood firm throughout all of these cases against attempts to get professors fired. And this is where our law of academic freedom, kind of a hazy concept in the law, comes from, and where our law about free speech on campus regarding public colleges come from. Now, I would say that mostly campuses had played a positive role in the history of freedom of speech. The free speech movement in 1964 in Berkeley, the important cases defending free speech rights of students, which really were from the 1970s. But then in the 1980s, you started seeing a real shift towards universities becoming both a place where you would preview new censorship regimes and kind of a laboratory for coming up with new ones. So I was talking to one of your students, and I was explaining, that I defend free speech on campus. And the very first question I got was, well, what about hate speech? And I get this all the time. And it's just kind of like, hate speech is a really old idea. And it sounds good, it polls well in terms of something that you should ban. But it works in a very predictable way that you don't have to be a First Amendment defender to see. It ends up being applied against surprising people. So for example, Romania, their Anti-Discrimination Council targeted a satirical magazine for committing hate speech against the party leader. In Indonesia, the parliament brought Ethics Council to bring charges against anyone who disrespects the dignity of its House and its members, very much grounded in hate speech language, pretty much coming from, that were really perfected more or less in US campuses in the 1980s. Kyrgyzstan, the Supreme Court upheld defamation charges against 3 critics who insulted the honor and dignity of the now former president. Erdogan uses this stuff all the time. Russia has adopted some of these arguments that are actually coming off of campuses. And I will say flat out, the European Union has turned into a complete holy mess on this stuff. And it's actually... it's funny, like I get called by a lot of European newspapers to give my opinion because I think they think of me as their like crazy American cousin who's like, you're all nuts, because they think we're nuts in the US. But for example, there were 330 arrests for grossly offensive behaviors in the UK in the past year. That Facebook in the EU, partially due to rulings coming from the EU, had to delete close to 300,000 posts every month for a violation of hate speech. Now, we can all kind of, have some kind of feeling that people shouldn't say hateful stuff, but there's a value in knowing what people actually think. So from my perspective, from a national security perspective, we have this great system to allow terrorists to say, hey, by the way, I hate people and I'm gonna go blow stuff up. By all means, let them tell us that if they want to tell us that. But in the process of stifling this stuff and erasing a lot of this stuff, we're actually in some ways breaking down that sort of Hayekian flow of ideas that also tells us the bad things about our societies. So I think that some of these efforts that are going on in the European Union, including probably the worst idea I've heard in my entire career, at least worst new one, the right to be forgotten, is going to result in the European Union knowing a lot less about the world in which they actually live. So I do actually think some of the ideas that come off campuses, some particularly the bad ideas, have a lot of effect. I am concerned, this whole book is essentially about, for all of my career, despite stereotypes, but I only started in 2001, the students were the best constituency for free speech on campus. They got it better than professors, and they got it certainly better than administrators. But sometime around 2013 and 2014, that started to change, and I started seeing a lot more demanding of professors not being allowed to speak, speakers, demands for new speech codes coming from students for the first time, at least since the late 80s, early 90s. So the trends have been concerning and negative, and not where you'd think we would be circa, I was pointing to circa 1991, 1989, that essentially we thought this was like the big victory of free speech liberalism. And instead, we have a democratic recession that I think is at least in part sort of a backlash to this sort of technocratic idea of speech policing. The end.
Good. So let me start back with you, Gabe. You kind of talked a little bit about how your views have changed a little bit. And I think I heard you making the case that, because of what you think about the Trump administration, that sort of hard line view that you might have taken 8 years ago in terms of the importance of the rule of law here, that you're inclined to bend that a little bit. And so let me push back on that and say, is that really the right position to take? Especially, the Republic's going to survive, and are you articulating a kind of it's legitimate but illegal kind of standard? How would you work that out?
Well, I think legitimate but illegal is exactly right, and that means that prosecutions should proceed, and that people who take it upon themselves, like Anonymous, who wrote this book, to reveal information, if it's classified information, wasn't really any in that book, but if it were classified, they should be subject to prosecution. But I would call upon people who know things about the workings of our government that are illicit, that are damaging to the country, who are in the White House or in bureaucracies, to come forward and to put the secret information to the public. And that would be a form of civil disobedience if it were not done anonymously. And the real problem is the anonymous leaking. And so we have this, just a recent case, this woman with the strange name of Reality Winner, who gave The Intercept some documents about Russian hacking of our state elections. And they were classified documents. And she was, the documents were, I think, helpful to public discourse and knowledge about the situation we're facing, but they were classified, and she was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. My sense is that if Reality Winner had, instead of surreptitiously providing those documents to The Intercept, had come forward and held a press conference and taken responsibility for bringing it into the public domain, she might not be in prison today.
But Daniel Ellsberg didn't do that.
Daniel Ellsberg also, he went underground. He was anonymous. He's considered a hero by many people. I have very mixed feelings about what he did. I think, the information that he put on the record was really, he's not known for the information. The information was old information. There was not a single document that was less than 3 years old. It was not about the Nixon administration. It was all Johnson and Kennedy material. And he was very careful also to redact what he did. He struck out anything about military movements and was quite conscientious at that point in his career. So I think it's quite different from some of the mega leakers that we've seen now, like Snowden and Chelsea Manning.
Oh. Let me skip to you, Greg. How do you square your kind of description of the campus to connect with some of the other things here? I'd say the popularity of Snowden. What's your impression there, and how does that kind of shape our understanding of where this larger dynamic is going in the country?
Snowden was, I don't know how popular he is on campus. I get the impression he is. He does appearances. I think he was at Students for Liberty, for example. I think he did a talk via satellite there.
From Moscow.
Yeah, and it's from Moscow, exactly.
His government paid for house in Moscow.
Right. So, but at the same time, it's not all that surprising, given that he's got the he's presented as sort of like a rebel against the system, which is a very sort of common way to make yourself popular among young people, is to look like the rebel with the cause, kind of thing. But I did want to get back to a little bit about how exactly and I'm not sure if the audience really knows this. So most of the countries in the world make it just flat out illegal to report on certain things and national security secrets. And what a lot of people don't know is that Australia, Canada, and Britain have very tight, and I think, once again, I think they're nuts, tight restraints on what the press can cover if it regards to national security. America is unique in the fact, and this particularly comes out of the 1970s, out of cases like the Pentagon Papers case, where essentially the rule is more or less, if it gets to, it's the government's job to make sure this doesn't get to the press. If this gets to the press, you're done. And there's only a handful of cases in which there's ever been a prior restraint issued for something that was considered a national security secret that was so serious. The one example that I teach in class is the famous Progressive case, which involved whether or not a magazine could publish how to make a was it hydrogen or atom bomb? Hydrogen bomb. So how you make a hydrogen bomb. But overall, this had a very predictable result because the court all at the same time, however, said that in Nixon v. Fitzgerald, I think it was called, and by the way, a different Nixon, which makes the case all the more interesting, was that the government can, however, have policies that limit the disclosure of employees, and of course, unsurprisingly, this means that everyone from Obama to Bush, enforce these really ferociously. But in terms of things where you're talking about the press, where were you thinking? What would be a situation where you could actually arrest a journalist?
Well, one case would be, as I said, the Battle of Midway.
No, sure,
Right
and when you're
after
actually
that,
in a war.
When the Chicago Tribune, but violations of the Comey statute, which it says it's communications intelligence, which punishes the publication, that's a word in the statute, of secrets pertaining to communications intelligence as a uniquely sensitive area. So communications intelligence encompasses a broad range of things today. Almost all of our intelligence is communications intelligence. So the law actually is a kind of loaded gun pointed at journalism right now. And I mean, it's one of the Trump administration doesn't seem to know this. And I mean, there are a lot of tools in the current law that if they took the enemies of the people rhetoric seriously, they actually could, within the law, within the First Amendment even, prosecute. Because the Pentagon Papers case, while it ruled out the possibility of a prior restraint, perfectly allowed for prosecution of the Times after the fact. In fact, 6 of the 9 justices said that if the same facts had come to them in a prosecution, they might even be tempted to convict, to uphold a conviction. So I think the legal structure is very ambiguous right now, and also quite a dangerous weapon as it stands. But fortunately, it's never been used in that way.
Sorry. Let me jump in here. Greg, not to pick on you, but you just used the phrase, if we were actually in a war. But of course, we are actually in.
Oh no, like a declared war. Remember that thing we used to do? The founding fathers wanted us to do.
Let me shoot this over to Melanie. Melanie, you kind of concluded with a positive note that, look, all things being equal, we're a lot better off today, civil liberties wise, than in the past. But is that in part because of the felt sense that the conflicts that we're in, although authorized in some ways, are not as felt a war as World War II, as was just said?
That's true, and in a way I'm grateful. I'm grateful that we're not sending hundreds of thousands of people to be killed. I'm grateful there aren't hundreds of thousands of people being killed in Europe right now. There are people being killed right now in Afghanistan and Nigeria and other places in the world. So those things are serious. Now, I don't know that the government's secrets about that kind of stuff, we're not invaded here in the same way that we were in the way that we were fighting the Civil War. We were invaded on 9/11. So as I said, there were detentions, there were other things that took place. There were deportations, and there were violations of civil liberties in that respect. But the nation is not at war in the same sense that we have been in the past. There's not a draft. And while there is an authorization, I think that a declaration of war can change things greatly, but I don't know that it would necessarily be legitimate to change speech laws in the same way that it would change the economy or change physically taking people and putting them in a place where they might be killed.
Now, Jamil, you talked about kind of the institutional tensions, right? The tensions between, on the one hand, this and these core values, and on the other hand, you absolutely have to protect secrets. Is that one of those things that can ever be really resolved? And what kind of lessons can we take away from that? Or is it something that has to be hashed out in every conflict with different precedents and different kinds of clashing and fighting the same battles all over again?
I think that in a lot of ways our values are changing over time, right? And our values about what we care about and what we protect and what we do, and the circumstances we find ourselves in any given conflict do change the way we look at these issues. And in a lot of ways we are in a very different world today in 2018 than we were on the day after 9/11. Right? We feel differently about that conflict, right? For those of you who are alive, all of us on the stage were alive during that thing, the felt sense of being violated, right, and the loss of life that people felt on that day. I recently was with a federal judge who was in the government at the time, and he could, even now today, talk about 9/11 and what he felt sitting on the runway. He was still drawn to tears, and it was a real moment. And I still have those feelings when you watch the 9/11, the videos of what was taking place that day. But for people who weren't alive in that era or were younger in that era, you don't have that sense. And that sense certainly isn't present in the American body politic today. And so I think that in part is why we don't feel like we're at war, even though if you asked any service member's family who's currently in Iraq or Afghanistan or Nigeria and is fighting against terrorism and ensuring that that battle, by the way, is not fought on this soil, but is fought on that soil, they would tell you they feel very much at war. Right, and so there is, I do think the felt sense of what is happening at a country at a given time, the type of conflict we're in, what it means for Americans, what it means for individuals, does change the way we analyze these questions. And by the time Daniel Ellsberg revealed what he revealed about the Vietnam War, the war had been going on for a long time. We were in a very different place at that point in time, and there's a lot of debates about how Vietnam started and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, a lot of debates about whether that war was the right war from the beginning or not, and whether they meant to authorize it when they voted whatever it was 89-2, or 88-2. But at the end of the day, these institutional tensions I think will always be there. I don't think we will ever resolve them fully, and I think that the moment will change that, right? But that moment, even now, right, this tension that Greg talks about on college campuses. It's true that it's become dramatically worse since 2013, but it was present when I was on campus in the 1990s, in the late 90s, when I was condemned, and as a traitor to my religion and a traitor to my skin color, because I dared to join a fraternity and dared to not be on the minority ballot for student government, right? And so it's dramatically gotten worse. Speech codes and trigger warnings, and I mean it's ridiculous. The same people who celebrate Edward Snowden is a hero because he fought against the man and revealed all this horrible information on campus don't want to fight against the man, and they want the man to protect them against things that make them uncomfortable and worry them and concern them, because God forbid we talk about controversial things or things that might hurt people's feelings. And it's a real problem. And so that has driven me in some ways to, while I am a strong defender of national security and the right of the government to protect secrets, to also join the board of directors of an organization that's out there litigating against campus speech codes today, Speech First. And so, these are tensions that in my own life, literally being on the board of an organization defending campus speech, defending the speech of students against bad speech codes. At the same time, I want to protect the right of the government to protect national secrets. And so I live that tension in my own head sort of on a daily basis.
Well, why don't we open it up to questions? We've got lots of hands, some mics come around. Just introduce yourself real quick.
Oh, sorry.
And keep it, concise in the form of a question. Go ahead up, and why don't we start with the woman in the back here.
Hi, I'm Rachel Bernard. We talked a lot about the role of the public sector in terms of maintaining free speech and how we deal with that. But I'd like to look a little bit at the role of some private sector organizations. Recently, it came out that the Myanmar government used Facebook to perpetrate genocide and encourage genocidal propaganda against the Rohingya population in the country. What do you think, keeping that in mind, what do you think the role is of organizations like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google in helping to either promote or defend? I guess the question is, how do you see the intersection of free speech and also maintaining safety of people and not allowing things like that kind of speech present?
Do you want to take, or either anybody? Go ahead.
No, sure. It's interesting because when I speak in Europe about this stuff, I'm an evangelist for the American system of First Amendment, which they all think is absolutely insane. They think we're crazy hippies with our weird ideas about freedom of speech. But I actually, when you teach it, it really is actually a pretty well thought out body of law. And when it comes to what was going on, I don't know as much about specifically what Facebook was doing in that context, but for example, the Rwandan genocide comes up a lot. And the answer to that is that's under any definition, that's Brandenburg incitement. Like when you're actually telling people to go out and kill your neighbors, that's something that's not even protected under our crazy system. And what I generally defend the American system of First Amendment as not just a system of laws that is idiosyncratically designed by the U.S., but probably the longest, most extended, best thought out way to have freedom of speech in the real world. So for example, when they kicked off Alex Jones from Facebook for hate speech, I was very much with David French, which he wrote in the New York Times saying, no, for God's sakes, don't say hate speech, because hate speech has no legal meaning in American law. It has no legal meaning whatsoever. It's even fuzzy in what it means in other countries' laws for the most part. Kick them out for defamation, kick them out for something that is already unprotected, so you keep it precise and you keep it clear. But a lot of these sort of like parade of terribles that people talk about, it's weird when you're talking about this over in Europe, their impression of like what American law means, and it's like, yeah, like not like I felt like I just got question after question that was kind of like, that's actually conspiracy to commit terrorism, like that's not even considered to be speech that you're describing there, or that's actually a death threat, which is not protected under any system. So I think a lot of so I actually thought it was a pretty good thing that Facebook and Twitter were heavily influenced by sort of American legal standards. What I'm worried about that's happening now is that decisions coming out of the EU are having effects on what you can see in the US, including the right to be forgotten, but also their hate speech rules, by some definitions, are supposed to apply not just to google.eu, it applies to google.com. Everywhere. So it seems like we're actually having some amount of what we're allowed to learn being limited by some of these experimentations and censorship actually going on in the European Union, which actually would violate our law. So we're in a bit of a bind in the moment.
All right, we got a bunch of questions here.
Sorry.
I think this gentleman right here, you sir, yeah.
Very good question.
Mike right here.
My name is Richard Chasdy, and I wanted to just make a couple of observations. So for example, there was precious little discussion of General Flynn being prosecuted under the Logan Act of, I think, 1799 in terms of representation. Is that true?
He's not being prosecuted under the
No,
Logan
that's
Act.
what I'm saying, that he wasn't prosecuted
Yeah.
under the Logan Act of 1799 for not being a duly authorized person to represent the United States. And then, of course, the James Comey case, in terms of the Hatch Act, had some traction in academic circles, but didn't gain really any traction in terms of government. Is there a way of thinking about isolating and identifying patterns of when prosecution occurs and when there's a constraining of prosecutorial efforts? And would identification of these trends lead to a more streamlined approach towards prosecution, which might in fact increase a deterrent value for outside influence in elections and in other political activities in the United States?
Show me what more recent prosecutions.
Yeah, I mean, I
years.
guess.
Totally following.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure I understand the connection, but if you do, and just take the Flynn case for example, right? I mean, I'm not sure. The Logan Act has never been used once ever. That prosecution is not completed. More importantly, I mean, there was debates about whether the Logan Act should be used against Flynn, right? Flynn, of course, was the designated representative of an already elected president. So, some question about whether you could actually prosecute somebody in that scenario, right? But then, the very same people are saying, boy, you should prosecute Flynn for that. We're saying that's great that Secretary Kerry can go around the world and talk to the Iranians about how they should evade the president's effort to get out of the Iran deal. So, these are debatable. The same people also said, by the way, Tom Cotton should be prosecuted for violating the Logan Act because he was writing a letter to the Iranian Supreme Leader during the Obama administration's negotiations. So the Logan Act is not a thing, right? It's the law, but nobody cares.
The discussions took place before the election.
not the ones that I'm aware of, but it was a debatable point. But point being, Tom Cotton, elected member of the U.S. Senate, right, writes a public letter with a number of other members, 50 some odd, 30, 40 some odd members of Congress, to the Supreme Leader, right, about the Iran deal. Claims he should be prosecuted for the Logan Act, right, because the Obama administration is making a deal with the Iranians, right. Secretary Kerry goes around telling the Iranians, here are 8 ways to evade the Trump administration and work with the Europeans, trying to evade the Trump administration getting out of the Iran deal. The same people on either side of that, both sides, by the way, Republicans and Democrats on opposite sides of these issues, said the other should be prosecuted for Logan Act violations, right? So I mean, it's just, and nobody's ever been prosecuted, so it doesn't matter, right? It's sort of not a thing, and so it's not just, that's not just prosecutorial discretion, right? That's just a law that's a dead letter that nobody really thinks
Well, it's not
is
quite
effective.
so, because during the Flynn affair, the Justice Department really was considering the Logan Act as they were investigating him. I agree with you that it's very unlikely there's going to be a prosecution under it, but that was the basis of their investigation.
I mean,
All right, well, let's keep going here.
Yeah.
This gentleman here has been waiting, and then right here. Yeah. Why don't we take 2, actually? Take them 2, and then let the panel go out.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Well, I'd like to get the opinion of the panel on this question in terms of, let's say, government secrets or information about government activities which are very unfavorably reflective of the government. I'm so old I can remember back to the Church Commission and the Pike Commission. Obviously the CIA thought this was going to be the end of the world, the worst possible thing, and the stuff that came out, I mean, is extraordinary. People have forgotten about it, but if you go back and realize what actually came out, even the stuff that was kept quiet, but this, I mean, never came out. So some people have suggested this. Let's say, hypothetically, that with the various revelations about the FBI currently and Nunes and all this stuff, let's say that there's more to that story than seems to come out every day. If a similar commission to Pike or Church was constituted to really dig it with subpoena power and so forth and so on, to dig into what really happened with the Russia dossier, FBI, whatever, Carter Page, it might be extremely, terribly hurtful to the government and the public confidence in the government. But would you support such a commission if the suggestion was that's the only way you can get to the truth on this?
Well, that is a bit of a hypothetical, but let's go ahead and take this other question. This gentleman right here.
My name is Gerald Hang. I came from Boston, Massachusetts. Very good to hear about the First Amendment. To the United States Supreme Court, freedom of speech for the private sector is basically don't yell fire, fire in a private, crowded room.
Oh.
I'm wondering whether Uncle Sam require hellfire before they act on the security issue. I mention this because in the old days of decolonization in Southeast Asia, especially Singapore, Malaysia, India, there are communist comrades who say, you Anglophile, British, American capitalist pig, what are you trying to do? You're trying to take over for the capitalist pig? Then
let me let the panel respond to all that.
Then my answer was, hey, Karl Marx was in the British Public Library and he wrote the book
right.
Das Kapital for you.
All right.
And after that,
all right. Well, I want to give the panel a chance.
My question is simply this.
Yeah.
Is Uncle Sam ready with the counter propaganda against the terrorists and against people who want to destroy this country? Are they ready?
All right. Yeah, actually, let me connect that, and let me connect both of those to actually what was discussed earlier about
I think
Facebook.
Coca-Cola
And I think
is
actually
great
it was
at
Jamil who brought up the business of, and actually several of you talked about the very real issue of Russian bots on these things.
Oh yeah.
And so yes, Greg, you made the case for let transparency
Sure.
so people can see what they think, but it's not people if it's a information operation. And so, how do you come at that? And it kind of touches some of these issues, both of these issues as well. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think that it's. I think what you're going to ultimately find is that if we leave these organizations, right, the Twitters, the Facebooks, and the world alone, and we just simply reveal what's happening, that the pressure will be on them. These are companies that make their money, right, off of eyeballs, and eyeballs want to know what's real and what's not real. And there is a built-in incentive for them to have accurate information being conveyed, right? And so I think that what you'll see over time, and you're already seeing that trend. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't need to call out what we're seeing happening on those systems, or that we don't need to call out the actors who are acting and take action, counter-propaganda or otherwise, against those actors and deter their activities, right? But I don't think that regulating sort of the speech that takes place on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever it might be is the right approach to solving this problem. I don't think it's be successful. I don't think it's the right approach. But I mean, Melanie, you've looked at this issue like historically. What's the right approach?
Yeah, what do we do?
Oh no.
Save
when
us.
you get into sort of this space, how do you deal with the free speech question when you're in times of war, or whatever? This is not a time of war, but there's
not?
Well, I don't mean it's a time of war when it comes to terrorism, but it may not be a time of war when it comes to Russia and us. But there's clearly a information war taking place right now, right? So what do you do with a free speech institution in that scenario?
Yeah, I don't know. But one thing that I am worried about is leaving this up to Congress.
Sure.
Now, I'm
But we
not
saw the
saying,
hearings, and the
right?
hearings were-
I'm not
right.
saying that they couldn't figure something out, but it is concerning.
But you're saying
But yes. So, look, I am not a specialist on that, but technology does change this, every so often, and we are in the midst of a big technological change, and where the government can look at you, but you have more opportunities to do things. I will say one thing that I wanted to touch on earlier, and I should have responded to better in my own question, is how do we talk about these things as a public? And how does our government talk about them with us? When we talk about, are we in a war? I don't know. Does our government talk to us like we're in a war? People are fighting and dying right now. And I'm glad that we don't have a draft. I'm grateful for a volunteer force of people that go. And I'm glad that it's not hundreds of thousands of people, and that it's not the first thing that we think about, because everything is rationed at home, and our people are, every family is affected by a death. But does our government treat it like it is serious and like it's important? I don't know. And so how is the government going to frame this and whatever they're going to want to do on this? And can they do anything that will actually galvanize public opinion, that will be acceptable? Can they explain it to us in a way that whatever happens, that we will be able to participate in that discussion, but also accept how it shakes out? So.
Yeah, and it's, in terms of this kind of like new problem with the bots, it was definitely one of those ones that I'm a recovering techno optimist. I'm very excited about the potential of social media. But the bots were really they're a sticky problem, and there's some ways you could relatively easily deal with them. One is which, you have to have some kind of identification, you have to use your real name on all these social media platforms. That makes me nervous primarily from the point of view of countries where, oh great, okay, so you're going to get arrested now for saying that you're talking about that you're gay, for example, or that you don't like Erdogan. I always have to get some digs in at him. But that might be the best of the worst solutions that could make a big difference.
Well, but we have a tradition in this country of anonymous speech.
We do, yeah.
Right? I mean, what about that?
And that's the thing. And I'm actually a little bit more. I'm a bad First Amendment person on that one issue. Is that I see how much better people argue when
they have to say who they are.
When they have to say who they are, and I've definitely experienced this myself. At the same time, but I always give a caveat. If you're in danger of being punished for what you said, then anonymity absolutely becomes essential. So I say this when I talk at universities. I'm like, listen, if I didn't think there was a realistic likelihood that this person is going to get in trouble for doing their underground newspaper, I'd be like, come out and say yourself in public. But I've seen enough that on certain campuses.
So can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
Okay, so take the author of the anonymous Washington Post op-ed about the president.
Yep.
That person is likely to be punished in some way, right?
Yep.
We've seen the president fire people all around.
Yep.
Okay to write anonymously or no, in that circumstance? Whereas a general matter, okay, in America, you're not going to be punished, so...
I don't have a general rule. I do it case by case.
Yeah. What about that one? What about that case?
On that one, I think probably okay. I think that maybe the public needed, made me feel a little less nervous about it. But yeah, anonymity and getting rid of it, it would make it easier to get over bots, but we would be sacrificing a lot in the meantime. The problem with flooding, unfortunately, is that you can also get non-bots to do it. Flooding basically the idea that Gary Kasparov talks about modern propaganda. Propaganda today, he says, and he's absolutely right, is not about convincing people of truth. They're making, it's to make it impossible to know what the truth is, and that everybody just kind of gives up on it. And that's a hard one to fight, because that can also just be done by slanted pundits. This can just as easily be accomplished, and possibly even more effective.
And actually is effectively accomplished on both sides today.
Yeah.
Right. Part of the challenge I think with
It's called
social
public
media.
opinion.
What's that?
It's called public opinion. Yeah. Public
Exactly right. But the part of the challenge of social media today is such a powerful medium is that what it's really doing. General Hayden has written about this, recently, the former CIA director, about how what it's really doing is ghettoizing, right, people into their own. It's so people who are already inclined to think one way read more on their Facebook feed about what their friends are saying and the people they think like them, right?
Which makes them more extreme.
Which makes them more extreme. It's pushing everyone to the edges.
You're arguing against your own proposition that eyeballs seek truth.
Well, no,
Because eyeballs are actually seeking confirmation of their own
which
truth.
is so that's exactly, you're exactly right about that. So I wonder whether, though, this debate that we're having in America about what it means to be in this post-truth era and what it means to have this ghettoization of people's views, whether that might actually allow us to spring back. I'm hopeful, and maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's my optimism. You're right. I'm arguing against my own optimism that we will spring back and recover, and that will force these institutions to fix themselves. But I don't think that it's productive. And I think these institutions, I say institutions, these organizations, right? Facebook, Twitter, the social media companies, are they going to trend more like traditional newspapers and media organizations who see their role as trying to help people get to truth, or are they going to see their role as trying to get eyeballs for the money they're making and allow people to ghettoize themselves? And I just don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to settle it tonight either. We are going to have to draw it to a close. Thanks to the panel, and thanks to all of you for coming out. Okay.
We have
Thank you very much.
chapter on polarization in the book talking about this.